Forget the glory of the P-51. Miller here, and I'm exposing the terrifying flying coffins the US tried to hide. These failed aircraft were absolute death traps in the sky. Subscribe now to uncover the secret disasters of World War II aviation before they are forgotten. Let's dive in. Bell P-59 Era Comet. The Bell P-59 Era Comet was America's first attempt at a jet fighter, but it was a total disaster. While it looked futuristic, its engines were incredibly weak, meaning it was actually slower than many propeller planes of that time. It could barely reach 400 miles per hour, which made it useless in a real dogfight against fast enemy jets. The U.S. Army decided it wasn't fit for combat and kept it a secret for years to avoid embarrassment. It proved that simply having a jet engine wasn't enough. You needed real power to survive. The General Electric engines were prone to overheating and lacked the thrust needed for steep climbs. Pilots found the aircraft sluggish and difficult to handle during critical maneuvers. Compared to the German Me-262, the P-59 was practically standing still in the air. It ended up being used only for training, as sending it into battle would have been a death sentence. The fuel consumption was also a nightmare, giving the plane a very short flight time. Many of the early prototypes suffered from engine flameouts, leaving pilots drifting in the sky. It was a bold experiment that failed because the U.S. was years behind in jet engine technology. Curtiss-Wright XP-55 Ascender. The Curtiss-Wright XP-55 Ascender was a strange experiment with forward-swept wings, meaning the wings pointed toward the nose. Engineers hoped this would make the plane more agile, but it actually made the aircraft dangerously unstable. During test flights, the plane would shake violently, making it nearly impossible for the pilot to control. It was so unstable that it became a flying hazard rather than a weapon. Only two were built before the military realized the design was a dangerous mistake that could never work. The wing structure suffered from aeroelasticity, meaning the wings would twist under pressure. This twisting caused the plane to enter uncontrollable dives without warning. One of the prototypes crashed during a routine test, killing the pilot instantly. This tragedy confirmed that forward-swept wings were far too dangerous for 1940s technology. The plane's landing gear was also a problem, often failing to lock into place during flight. The cockpit visibility was poor, making it nearly impossible to see the runway. It was a design that tried to fight physics and lost spectacularly. Vultee XP-54 Swooze Goose. The Vultee XP-54 Swooze Goose had one of the weirdest shapes in history, with a cockpit placed far back and the engine in the middle. It was designed to be a high-performance fighter, but the layout created massive balance problems and poor visibility for the pilot. The plane was so unstable during takeoff and landing that it felt like a gamble every time it left the ground. Official reports show it failed every basic requirement for a combat aircraft. The tandem cockpit meant the pilot had a restricted view, making landing a guessing game. Its landing gear was notoriously fragile and often collapsed under the plane's own weight. The engine placement caused extreme vibrations that rattled the entire airframe during flight. It was an engineering nightmare that proved different isn't always better. The weight distribution was so off-center that the plane tended to tilt during sharp turns. It required constant correction from the pilot just to keep the wings level. Most experts agreed that the design was a failure before it even left the drawing board. Do you think a plane with such a funny name could ever have won a war? Tell me in the comments. Northrop XP-56 Black Bullet. The Northrop XP-56 Black Bullet looked more like a UFO than a fighter jet, featuring a flying wing design with no traditional fuselage. The goal was to reduce drag and increase speed, but the result was a plane that couldn't even fly straight. It suffered from terrible stability issues, and the engine was far too weak to push the heavy, odd-shaped body through the air. It was so bad that pilots were terrified to fly it, and the project was scrapped almost immediately. Without a traditional tail, the plane had no way to stabilize its direction, causing it to yaw violently. The cockpit was cramped and offered almost zero visibility for the pilot during takeoff. Every flight was a struggle against the wind, as the plane fought the pilot's every command. It remains one of the most visually bizarre failures in military history. The plane suffered from extreme wing flutter, which threatened to shake the wings right off the body. It was barely faster than a slow transport plane, making it useless for combat. The Black Bullet was essentially a lead weight that happened to have wings. Fisher XP-75 Eagle. The Fisher XP-75 Eagle was a desperate attempt to create a high-speed fighter using a unique ducted fan system. Instead of a normal propeller, the engine pushed air through a tube to create thrust, which was an early ancestor to jet technology. However, the design was a mechanical nightmare, and the plane was plagued by overheating and structural failures. It was so poorly built that it barely functioned as an aircraft, let alone a fighter. It remains a footnote in history as a failed leap toward the jet age. The ducted fan created massive amounts of drag, canceling out any speed gains from the engine. The airframe was constructed with materials that couldn't withstand the heat generated by the internal fan. Test flights revealed that the plane had an alarming tendency to stall at low speeds. It was essentially a heavy glider with a broken engine attached to it. The internal ducting system frequently leaked air, reducing the thrust even further. It was so underpowered that it struggled to climb even a few thousand feet. The project was canceled after the military realized they were wasting money on a fantasy. Bell XP-77. The Bell XP-77 was meant to be a lightweight fighter that could be produced quickly and cheaply. Unfortunately, lightweight actually meant underpowered, as the engine simply couldn't handle the plane's weight. It had an abysmal climb rate and lacked the speed needed to intercept enemy bombers or fight other fighters. Test pilots reported that the plane felt sluggish and unresponsive, making it a liability in the air. The build quality was poor, with parts that felt flimsy compared to the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt. It failed to reach the minimum speed requirements set by the U.S. Army Air Forces. The aircraft's handling was so poor that it couldn't perform basic combat roles effectively. It proved that cutting costs in aviation usually leads to a lethal product. The aircraft was so unstable in the air that it required constant manual correction. It was completely outclassed by almost every enemy fighter it was meant to fight. The military eventually realized that a cheap plane is useless if it can't survive a single dogfight. If you were a pilot, would you trust a cheap plane with your life during a war? Drop your answer in the comments. Curtiss XP-62. The Curtiss XP-62 was essentially a redesigned P-40 Warhawk, meant to be a more efficient version of a plane the U.S. already used. However, by the time it was tested, aviation technology had moved so fast that the XP-62 was already obsolete. It offered no significant increase in speed or firepower, meaning there was no reason to replace the P-40 with a slightly different version of itself. The military saw it as a waste of resources and canceled the project before it could ever see battle. The improvements made to the fuselage didn't provide the expected aerodynamic boost. Pilots found that it handled almost identically to the older P-40, offering no tactical advantage. It was a classic case of too little, too late in the fast-paced world of wartime engineering. The project wasted thousands of man-hours on a plane that added zero value to the war effort. The engine upgrades were barely noticeable in actual flight tests. It lacked the high-altitude performance needed to challenge the newer German aircraft. It was a boring failure that simply didn't bring anything new to the table. Curtiss YP-60. The Curtiss YP-60 was an even more failed version of the XP-62, attempting to fix the original's mistakes with a different engine. Despite these changes, the plane remained slow and lacked the agility required for modern air combat. Production was a disaster, and the few planes built were quickly relegated to training roles because they were useless as fighters. It proved that you cannot simply tweak an old failing design into a modern winner. It was a dead-end path in American aviation history. The new Pratt & Whitney engines added weight without providing enough extra thrust to make a difference. The aircraft struggled to maintain altitude when fully loaded with ammunition and fuel. Its turn radius was far wider than its competitors, making it an easy target for enemy aces. It ended its life as a glorified trainer, never seeing a single real combat mission. The airframe suffered from severe stress fractures due to the heavier engine. It was plagued by oil leaks and cooling system failures that kept it grounded. It served as a warning that some designs are simply too broken to be fixed. Lockheed XP-58 Chain Lightning. The Lockheed XP-58. Chain Lightning was designed to be a massive, heavy-hitting fighter, but it became an overweight monster. The plane was so heavy that its engines struggled to keep it in the air, and it suffered from constant mechanical breakdowns. It was supposed to be a long-range interceptor, but it was actually slower than the bombers it was meant to protect. Official records show it was a total failure in every performance category. The design suffered from weight creep, where adding features made the plane heavier and heavier. The engines frequently failed due to the immense strain of lifting the massive airframe. It was so cumbersome that it could barely maneuver in a straight line during high-speed runs. It was effectively a bomber that tried to pretend it was a fighter. The Chain Lightning name was a joke because the plane lacked any real speed. It was so wide that it created massive drag, slowing it down even further. Most of the prototypes were scrapped almost immediately after their first flights. Would you rather fly a small, fast plane or a huge, heavy one that can't move? Let me know in the comments. McDonnell XP-67 Bat. The McDonnell XP-67 Bat featured a wild, twin-boom design with two separate tails and a strange cockpit layout. While it looked intimidating, the plane was an aerodynamic nightmare that suffered from severe instability. The pilots reported that the aircraft would roll and dive unpredictably, making it a death trap during high-speed maneuvers. It was so dangerous that the Army Air Forces scrapped the entire program to prevent further crashes. It stands as a reminder that looking scary doesn't make a plane effective. The twin booms would vibrate violently at high speeds, threatening to rip the plane apart. The cockpit was located in a position that made it nearly impossible to see the runway during landing. Control response was delayed, meaning the pilot's inputs didn't happen in real time. It was a daring experiment that failed because it ignored the basic laws of physics. The plane's center of gravity was constantly shifting, making it a nightmare to trim in flight. It had a tendency to enter a flat spin that was nearly impossible to recover from. It is remembered as one of the most dangerous prototypes ever built. Innovation isn't always pretty, and these failed fighters prove it. Now you know the secrets the history books often skip. If you want more deep dives into the dark side of military engineering, subscribe now and join the journey. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.